Sometimes I make observations, looking at other people that kind of, it doesn't make sense to me at first. And then kind of after a little while of thinking and seeing other people, I make kind of similar observations and I come to these conclusions. So the other night I was watching McGregor and Khabib, that fight that they had, one of the biggest fights in UFC history. I really wanted to kind of watch Khabib and how he operates and how he tires his opponent out before kind of mauling them. Has his weight over their body, just fatigues a striker, and then a striker like McGregor can't punch anymore because he's just absolutely dead. His arms are dead, heart and lungs are burning, and he's just basically spent force. So I was kind of watching the fight, and I kept looking at McGregor, how he's built, right? So this is a guy that's, renowned for his power. He can punch really well. He's really accurate, and he's definitely had lots of knockouts in his career, and that's kind of his best thing that he has that left. I'm looking at his physique, and I've since kind of watched a few more fights kind of in the last few days. He's got an interesting physique. So he's a very slim guy. Obviously, they have to cut down, but his upper back, his lats are very, very well developed. Now, I see this all the time with boxers. Why is it that boxers have really strong upper backs? A punch is essentially a push. It's kind of like a bench press. You're pushing, you're throwing your hand forward. So why would the stuff on the back of the shoulder girdle be so developed? I see that all the time. You see it all the time with boxers that have these incredibly well-defined traps and lats. Now, I don't know whether they do weight training for that or what they do, but that's kind of the observation that I've seen. One of the other things that I've kind of heard from coaches, in my time, is that a big bench press comes from a strong upper back. Now, why is that? Right? Why is that the thing? It's like an antagonist training for something that the agonist has to do. It's like a base. They always talk about it's like a base. Also, you also see guys who are really good at bench presses, bench pressing, big weight. You see it all the time in bodybuilding. Generally bodybuilders are much better bench pressers than powerlifters, because bodybuilders are concerned about the upper body, the, pecs and all that. So they spend a lot of time, a lot of reps into kind of the chest, the triceps and whatnot. And they have really kind of, this is my experience at least, they have really good bench presses that can do, crazy amount of weight for heaps of reps without directly training strength. Like doesn't seem they train for one rep maxes kind of like powerlifters do. One of the things that I've seen with them as well is they also have big biceps. Now, I don't know whether these is kind of incidental findings because bodybuilders are all about physique and they want to have strong arms, strong upper back, strong chests. But that's another thing that I've seen. So it's almost like if you want to have a big push, you need to have a big pull, right? That's what it seems as though to me. So that's kind of in my head right now. And I kept thinking about why that is so effective, training the antagonist muscle so the agonist can perform really, really well. It's kind of like a base. We always talk about it. One of the things that happened to me yesterday was that I heavily loaded my quads, right? So I did my normal squats like you're seeing it today. Today I worked up to 160 kilos. Very, very low on power today because of what I did yesterday, I believe. So yesterday I did my normal squatting routine. I did a lot of quad extensions or leg extensions. Went quite heavy, went up to I think 30 kilos for a set of 30, I think, or 40 kilos on my little bench with the quad extensions, leg extensions. Then after that, I went over to some pin squats, and I was doing pin squats with about a quarter squat, so very, very high kind of pins, and I was really just trying to isolate that kind of the quad portion of the squat. And so definitely I worked up to 230 kilos for a set of 10, and I felt my quads. I felt immense amount of strength through my core and glutes. And in yesterday's video, I said to you guys, I'm really interested to see how I'm going to pull up, that night and then this morning. So now it is 5:30 in the morning. I wanted to do like a little longer session today. I've got a big day ahead of me, but I'm basically unable to. So yesterday, the focus was essentially quads, anterior chain. This morning I've woken up and my hip flexors, so my hips, feel weird. They feel tight, they feel weird, but not normal weird. They feel different weird. I feel a lot of kind of instability. I feel just uncertainty kind of around the hip flexors, which is not something that I've felt before, this kind of obviously. So I kind of worked up to 160 kilos today, and that just feels weird. Like I've got a lot of power in my glutes, and my hamstrings. I feel like the weight doesn't feel heavy, but I just have trouble transitioning from like that parallel position and going forward. So I've had similar these kind of sensation experience when I did block pulls. I don't know whether you guys have done block pulls for like a bit of time. Same kind of positioning. You're kind of really kind of extended in the knee and the hip, and it's basically like, you're pulling the bar from the maybe knees or just above the knees, kind of the lockout portion. I don't know about you guys, but when I did that, I also felt this kind of sensation where the hip flexors just feel weird. They feel kind of left out, and they feel like they're gonna snap, although they can't snap, right? I've never heard anybody snapping a hip flexor. So this morning I did 160, and I thought, man, I wonder if I can do some direct psoas or hip flexor work. Now, I've done this type of stuff in the past when I was focusing on core, but I've never felt the need to do hip flexors more than I had the need this morning. So what I did today was I basically did what I've done in the past. I kind of named it the psoas curls or the psoas raise or whatever it is. You'll see it in a second. I've taken a couple of clips. Basically, you sit down on a bench, you put a dumbbell on your knee or just above the knee, and you basically curl one leg up to your chest. It really fires up the hip flexors, the psoas, the rectus femoris, I suppose, and it gives you like a really nice feeling. It really kind of burns up that area. But that's another thing kind of that popped into my head and kind of reminded me of that whole McGregor boxer thing, where if you want to have a big squat, you have to also have strong hip flexors. Now, what do hip flexors do in a squat? Now, obviously they're on the other side of the powerhouses, right? So the glute is kind of one of the main drivers in the squat. The hip flexors on the other side of the hip, so it stabilizes the joint. It's an antagonist to hip extension. The psoas is a hip flexor. So when we squat, we want to hip extend. However, when we're going down in the eccentric portion, the hip flexors pull us down in a way. So human movement is interesting because it doesn't happen like a normal machine. It doesn't just happen, okay, this is what's happening, we're loading this side. No, there's so many other things going on. There's so many different forces at play. So a good way to think about it is, if you want to punch somebody in the face, you need a strong back. If you want to have a big bench press, you need a strong back. If you want to have a big squat, you need to have a big set of, strong set of hip flexors. We see a lot of hip flexor training. I've done this in the past when I come experimenting with hip flexor training. We see a lot of hip flexor training in sprinting. So I've kind of in the past looked up on social media what sprinters do for their psoas. It's really interesting how they go about it. Obviously, sprinting is all about hip flexion. You have to raise your knee to your chest and then explode down as fast as you can and go into hip extension. And you do that many times over, and that's your race. So it's not just about quads and glutes with sprinting. These hip flexors need attention. So I wonder whether hip flexors are what an upper back is to a boxer. So hip flexors are very important for a squatter, like an upper back is important to a boxer or a bench presser. So just an interesting observation. I don't know whether you guys have ever thought about this, why the opposite is so crucial when you're trying to do something. They talk about the base. So if you want to have a really strong squat, you need really strong hip flexors. Now, when you go into a deep squat, obviously you go into deep hip flexion. Now, there's no other way to squat deep without extreme hip flexion. Some of you guys have complained to me, and I've definitely had these type of experiences myself about butt wink, when the pelvis kind of goes into that posterior pelvic tilt kind of in the bottom portion of the squat. One of the things that I've said to you guys as well, of course, address your adductors, your glutes, your hamstrings, or address the whole posterior chain, because that kind of contributes to that tucking of the pelvis. But one of the things that I often say as well is that look at your hip flexors, because if you think about what the hip flexors do, they originate from that lumbar spine, from T12 all the way down to L5. It's kind of like a fan muscle that kind of comes out of all those vertebrae, and then it feeds into the leg, inserts into the leg, kind of like that proximal femur. And so when that structure contracts, you have hip flexion. So if you want to have a flat back in a deep hip flex position, you have to have strong hip flexors or psoas, iliopsoas, to, put the back in an arch, right? Because you don't want a rounded back. A rounded back means you've got yourself a butt wink. What you want is really strong hip flexors to pull that back into an arch in that bottom position, so you can have your back flat. Anyway, I find it kind of really interesting to see that smashing the quads, smashing the glutes one day completely puts the hip flexors in this weird position the following day. I really feel weak because my hip flexors have kind of let go a little bit. So I've already done a few sets, as you can see here. I'm going to do some more after this video. Really just pump as much blood as I can into them. I just feel like I need to do that. It's kind of a reactive training session this morning. I need to pump some blood in there because my quads and glutes feel super pumped up from yesterday's session, and I feel like these guys need some love as well. All right, guys, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.